So, our goal today is to talk about fiscal policy. So far, we have talked about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, as well as demand and supply. So, first, looking at how individual businesses and consumers come together to exchange goods and services in markets. That was demand and supply. Then we looked at how all levels of GDP at every price level constitute aggregate demand, as well as our aggregate supply. Today, we're going to take a look at fiscal policy. So, that has to do with deliberate actions on the part of the government to influence the economy. We've also talked about this question: what level of government intervention is appropriate when it comes to stabilizing the economy? That's what fiscal policy is all about. So, like I said, the definition of fiscal policy is deliberate changes in two things. You've got government spending, number one, taxes, number two. So, government spending has to do with that portion of the GDP that is G. So, we're not talking about transfer payments, we're not talking about shifting money from the tax base to someone else, like in the form of Social Security or unemployment benefits. We're talking about increases in things that the government spends money on that actually count towards the GDP, or decreases, can go either way. The other policy that's part of fiscal policy is changes in taxes. So that could be increasing or decreasing taxes, depending on what the problem is that we're seeing happen in the economy. So, regardless of whether government spending or taxes are chosen, those changes are designed to achieve full employment of resources. So, full employment of our land, labor, and capital. It's designed to control inflation so we don't have runaway price increases, and it's designed to encourage economic growth. So, those are rightward shifts of our AD and AS curves. All right, now if we were in class in person, we'd be talking about these questions in groups. I left them in here to kind of be a self-check for you, to be thinking about how some of these things we've already learned impact the stuff that we're covering here today. So the first question is, what fiscal policy action did Congress and the president take in April and December of 2020? So that would be deliberate changes in government spending or deliberate changes in taxes. So if you want to pause for a second, pause the video and think about it or look it up. So the answer, of course, is that the government provided stimulus checks to people in the country. Now, those stimulus checks don't actually count towards the GDP because they're just transferring money from the tax base to individual consumers. However, those consumers then turn around and spend the money, and that's where it begins adding to the GDP. So there's two types of fiscal policy: expansionary and contractionary. Expansionary fiscal policy is fiscal policy that would be in use during a recession. It's designed to increase the size of the GDP, increase the size of the economy, and so therefore our taxing and spending policies look like this. When it comes to expansionary fiscal policy, we're looking at increasing government spending, so we're pushing money into the economy that way, or we're looking at decreasing taxes. If we decrease taxes, then people get to keep more of their income and they can choose how they want to spend it. In either case, what will happen is that a budget deficit is created. So basically, the government will undertake policy to try to fill that gap, that budget deficit, and that's usually through borrowing money or through printing money. So it's a stopgap measure. It's not a foolproof way to solve every problem, but it is used to sort of dampen the blow of a recession. So either pumping money into the economy through government spending or decreasing taxes so that consumers can hold more of their own resources. All right, so just mentioned that expansionary fiscal policy is used during a recession. So then the next question to think about that would be review from what we've talked about are, what are the other three phases of the business cycle? Hopefully you remember those are trough, expansion, and peak. So all four of those ups and downs in the GDP together comprise the business cycle. So just throwing that in there as a little bit of review. The other type of fiscal policy that the government can use is called contractionary fiscal policy. It's designed to specifically contract or make smaller the size of the economy. And you might ask, why on earth would we want to make the economy smaller? Well, the inflation that the United States has experienced after the COVID pandemic is a good example of why. So, generally, contractionary fiscal policy is used during demand pull inflation when you have too much money chasing too few goods, just like we do after the COVID policies of the pandemic. So, the opposite policy options are available to the government. They can decrease government spending and or they can increase taxes. The purpose of that is to suck money out of the economy, to reduce the amount of money that people have to spend so that there's not as much competition for goods and services. That won't cause inflation to go away, or I should say it won't cause prices to drop necessarily, but it should help decrease those inflationary pressures where there's competition, and so people are bidding each other up on items and causing prices to go up. Unlike expansionary fiscal policy, contractionary fiscal policy results in a budget surplus. So then the government has money left over at the end of the year. They can take that and use it to pay off debt. Again, that's taking money out of the economy, so that lowers the inflationary pressures. So then, next review question: besides demand pull, what is the other type of inflation? Hopefully, you remember that it was called cost push inflation. This is where you have rising costs of production that lead to rising prices. So, contractionary fiscal policy will help with demand pull inflation issues, but it won't necessarily fix cost push inflation issues. And unfortunately, in 2022, we have both of those things happening, both demand pull and cost push. And so, any contractionary fiscal policy will help with the demand pull inflation, but we'll still be dealing with high energy prices and everything that drives with cost push inflation. All right, so then there are a couple of options that the government has, and a lot of it has to do with political persuasion or political philosophy. So we're a two-party system. We've got the Democratic Party on the one hand and the Republican Party on the other. And both of those parties have different ideas about how the government can best influence the economy. So we're going to talk about what both of those policy options are and then see if you can match them up with which party you think it relates to. So the first policy option would be to expand the size of the government. In this case, the political party that subscribes to this viewpoint believes that the government is best equipped to solve economic problems and that they can do so by using effective policy. So a political party that wants to expand the size of the government will take the following actions. In a recession, they will increase government spending. So instead of giving money back to people through tax breaks, they'll pump money into the economy to allow the government to control where that spending goes and hopefully do so more effectively. In times of inflation, they'll increase taxes, again, taking money out of consumers' hands through higher taxes as opposed to decreasing their reach with government spending. And through those policies, they believe the government can have the most impactful influence on the economy. Now, on the other hand, you can, or the government can, act to reduce the size of itself. And there is a political party that believes that is the best way to go. So in that case, in the case of a recession, a party that wanted to reduce the size of government would decrease taxes. They would allow consumers to keep more of their own money as opposed to printing money and undertaking greater debt on the form of the national debt in order to make the government bigger. In times of inflation, then, they would decrease government spending, again, letting consumers keep more of their income to decide how they want to spend it rather than the government making those choices. So with those things in mind, sorry, I skipped a slide there. With those things in mind, which political party do you think supports expanding the size of the government? They think the government has the best answer and is in the most influential position to fix economic problems. And which political party do you think wants to reduce the size of the government, meaning they feel like individuals have the best answers to the problems as opposed to the government? Well, if you said that the Democratic Party is the party that supports expanding the size of government, you would be correct. The Democratic Party believes that the government holds the key to bringing equity and equality to all citizens, and that everyone is better off when the government intervenes. On the other hand, the the Republican Party believes that reducing the size of the government is more beneficial to individuals, that every person can best make the decision that benefits themselves as opposed to the government making those decisions for them. And so those are the two main differences between the political parties. It has to do ultimately with the size of the government and how they think the government impacts the economy. So just to give you a little idea of what kinds of budget deficits and surpluses we're talking about, this is a graph that shows budget surpluses and deficits from 1994 through 2014. So you can see the last time that we had a budget surplus was here in the early 2000s, prior to September 11th of 2001. That was when Bill Clinton was in the presidency and the Republicans controlled Congress. And so we had a true bipartisan agreement to increase or to decrease the size of the government to allow this surplus that would balance the budget and would pay off our debt. Unfortunately, we have not run another surplus since that time, since 2001. This first dip here happened when we began the War on Terror in 2001. This big one down here in 2009 happened with the last big recession. And since that time, the deficits have decreased, although we went, this graph doesn't show 2020, and the farthest it goes is $1.4 trillion. We actually ran a $3 trillion deficit in 2020, which means if 2020 was added to this graph, the bar that you would be looking at for that year would be twice as long as these ones here in 2009 and 2010. Bottom line is we're in a world of hurt as far as debt. So we either have to increase taxes or we have to decrease spending or we have to do some combination of both if we ever want to get out of national debt. But so far, our politicians haven't been able to agree to a plan that they will both work on together, that both sides will work on together. All right, so what we're going to do for the rest of the period is you guys get to try your hand at the fiscal ship. And in the next video, I'll be explaining how to go about playing this game that's known as the fiscal ship.